Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is the show where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. And joining me today is John Reynolds, CEO and founder of Titan Property Developments. Welcome, John.
Thank you, Steve.
Nice to see you. And Simon Das, property investor, finance broker and founder of 978 Group. Welcome to you, Simon.
Hi.
Thank you both for coming in today. I know we're heading into a period of strikes and chaos on the railways, aren't we? And all sorts of issues with the housing market, but let's try and put some of the things right, shall we? So Simon, your first question. Do the panel think that there is any variation in the ability and qualifications to raise investment funds for buy-to-let comparing the south of England to the north of England?
Okay, well, there's probably three main criteria that you need to take into account when raising funds wherever you are. One of them is a solid business plan, so something that investors or banks are going to buy into, a fair rate of return, and some suitable security, whether that's a first charge, a second charge, a debenture, a PG. So fundamentally, you need to offer those things whenever seeking finance, wherever you are in the country, I would say. I don't think that changes. If you are seeking finance, that business plan becomes your experience plus the project that you're looking at. And you know, if you're looking to build 20 houses, then hopefully you've built 10 or 15 before now. On the converse, if you're looking at raising money for just a small buy-to-let deal, then you only just need experience in minor refurbishments perhaps. So it's got to make sense to an investor or to a bank. You've got to be able to offer that security, whether it's a first charge or a second charge. Most conventional lenders are going to look for first charges. And other than that, there's the differences I see between the north and the south are more around availability of capital. So there's plenty of banks that will lend in the north of England. There are some London-centric lenders out there. There's not many that are northern-centric. So you've not got access to every single lender, but the vast majority will lend in England and Scotland throughout. But when seeking private investment, there's probably less money in the rural north than there is in the centre of London. So trying to seek that.
Would that make an investor sort of less risk averse than perhaps down here? I don't know. Or would it have the reverse effect?
I don't think they'll be less risk averse. Risk is somewhat perceptive. You know, investors may be comfortable in 4-bed houses in the north of England because they've built some themselves, and other investors might be comfortable investing in tower blocks in London. So I think the risk element, if you're putting enough equity in, that obviously reduces risks dramatically for an investor or lender. Beyond that, it's are they comfortable with that type of project?
Have you seen any difference in the sort of loan to value ratios between south and north?
No. The loan to value ratios, I would say, are pretty much 75% when you're looking at buy-to-let investment properties. If it's commercial, that reduces down probably to 65%, and more obscure assets and development you might have to reduce a little bit further, particularly in the current climate.
Okay. John, you've developed around the country. Do you find any difference in attitude from lenders, north to south?
Not so much from lenders. You mentioned private, though. I think that's something where it always feels like there's an interest in something in the south, which surprises me because actually our last two projects have been in the north, and I think there's real opportunity there. But if you start talking to someone about a project in Woking or Reading, instantly they're interested. Whereas it's a bit different. Mentioned Stafford before the programme.
Bit more of a sell.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd agree.
But I mean, where you are, Simon, I mean, you've got some amazing products sort of coming to market up there. You've got the Eden project and all sorts of.
Absolutely. You know, for me, it's one of the safest places to invest. I know it very well, but it's low risk and fairly reasonable return because you've got lower property prices, and with the likes of the Eden project, capital appreciation is going to be vast. So, yeah.
Good. Okay. All right. John, I want to move away from being a buy-to-let investor and enter the world of property development. Well, good luck with that, this time. Could the experts offer any advice, as I'm torn between looking at a city-based opportunity with the potential of building 10 to 20 apartments, or one perhaps in the countryside, which would provide the equivalent value in houses? What are the complexities and other differences that I should consider?
There's quite a lot in that question. I think even just listening to Simon, I think if you know your area and you know your location, then really focus on that, because you'll know what best product is going to be received. And of course, what your exit is as well, whether you're building to sell or building to rent, has different connotations in the market we've got now. There's been a definite shift since COVID on people wanting outside space or access to it. So town centre apartments that would typically have just sold, in principle, then there's people now that have a shift of mindset where actually, if I haven't got a balcony or I don't have a communal area or a roof terrace, that's actually put people off. So as the aspiring developer, I think also consider the fact that if you're going to do a town centre apartment, connecting services, getting the trades in, the complexities can be very different to a more rural development where a brownfield site lends itself to potentially an easier route through planning and a more saleable product.
And you mentioned one thing there, which is time and ease of sale. I mean, time's the one thing a lot of people fail to take into account, isn't it, when they're developing and looking to sell?
It's so important.
It's the one factor that they overlook.
It is, and time is money. Unless it's all your own money, typically you're taking senior debt. You might even be bringing a private investment alongside that, and you try and agree a timescale from the outset of how long it's going to take through planning, construction, and even the sales journey now. It's 4 to 5 months for a normal mortgage to go through, whereas before that was unheard of. So that's all time.
Well, I know I made a rather sarcastic sort of opening comment about sort of going into property development, but Simon mentioned, well, if you're going to build 10 or 20 apartments or whatever it is, then you've probably done 10 or 12 before, or you've got the experience. Well, unfortunately, in really good times, and we saw it a lot down here, you got a lot of developers that have sort of built their mum's conservatory and then went on to want to develop a 70-story block. Now, in good times, they get away with it. But in times like we're heading for now, I think you've got to be so cautious about what you do.
Yeah.
And again, I go back years that bank managers used to say to me, if I say no to you, Stephen, don't have an argument with me. Just ask yourself why I'm saying no. And I think that advice would apply very well today.
Yeah. You've got to be very, very careful.
You've got to be on it.
And lenders are being very, very careful. So track record and experience as a developer is going to make a massive difference. And you're putting your case forward of knowing the area, the location, the product. And if you're actively developing now, you understand what the build costs, the material costs, all that is ultimately something but you come in from a 3-year break or you haven't got that experience, you may not be able to manage it.
Yes. And I mean, don't forget, we talked in an earlier programme about the difficulties with planning at the moment, permitted development rights, or whether you go for full planning or whichever route you choose. And it's very important to remember that whilst those planners will be sort of very reasonable in their attitude, and they shouldn't be treated as enemies, as some people do. You often have very good access to planning departments, and you should really use that. But you've got to remember that they're not going to make their decisions based on your profitability or your survival.
No.
And that I think that's quite an important consideration. I know, John, you've told me before you've had sort of, I won't say run-ins with planners, but certainly had difficult times with them. And it's
as a developer you're going to, but where I always approach it from the same position, and that is to go to the planners, very much allowing them to feel like they are involved. And what would you like to see here? And how do we work together? And that can work really well. And that's a great attitude, rather than leaving that sort of potential perceived attitude as a developer. This is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. it does then, it's determined then about how the planner responds to that. But
well, I've said it before in this program. I have a friend who's a very high, I suppose, say KC now, not QC, in planning, and I once went to him with a failure that I'd applied for, and I said, "Can we appeal this?" And he said, "Yeah, you can appeal it if you've got the money." And then he said, "But why don't you just consider why they've turned it down?" And he said, "My guess is they've turned it down because they don't like what your architect's drawn as a project." So I said, "Yeah." So he said, "Well, go away and tell your people to draw something that the planners do like." And he said it'll be the cheapest option and the fastest option. And I've sort of remembered that all the way through, and I think it was excellent advice. And again, very relevant today, I think.
yeah.
Okay, well, that's all we've got time for in this half of the show. So join me again after the break when we'll be asking John and Simon more of your questions. Hello, I'm Stephen Galvin. Welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time, and I'm joined by John Reynolds and Simon Das. Simon, I'm considering buying a property in the Lake District for the purpose of renting out for holiday lets. I read that there is a resistance to people buying second homes in the area. Would I be subject to that resistance or bad feeling making a purchase that would be just for investment only?
So there's resistance for change anywhere, isn't there? There's that phrase used in property a lot, not in my backyard. So there is clearly going to be some people who have the opinion of, you're from outside the area, you're looking to make a profit in our area, and they have that sort of, that causes them some friction. But I think you can look at it in two ways, and you can look at what you're actually providing for the area. If you're buying a property that needs some work, get in there, regenerate it, do the frontage up as well, so it enhances the street. Get around local businesses and cut deals with them and say that you'll put their advertisements for their restaurants and their bars in your welcome pack for your holiday guests, and you can build relationships in the community like that and get a warm reception.
What about the argument that it takes available lower to mid-range properties away from those that want to get on the housing ladder?
Yeah, a fair argument. What you do find in the Lake District is there's actually restrictions. There's occupancy restrictions in place. So more than the negative feeling you might get from some local residents.
Explain the occupancy.
Yeah, so it's property by property. So even on neighbouring properties, the restriction may not be there. But ultimately, it can mean that if you aren't from the area, you can't buy the property, or if you don't have a job offer in the area, you can't buy that property. So that's something you want to check very early on. That's the local council, as far as I understand it.
And they do it property by property?
It's property by property. It's not necessarily a whole area. It might be that some properties in a certain area are reserved for local people. So that's one thing you need to combat. And in theory, that should protect, the properties that are needed for local people. I think you've got to do it with a community spirit, with a conscience, provide quality, give a little back to local businesses, support local people a little bit as best you can, whilst at the end of the day, it's your hard-earned money. And if you're willing to invest it into something that can benefit an area, then
I'm just trying to think of the ups and downs on that one. I mean, if I had in front of me now two people that were perhaps selling and marketing property in France, they'd say, "Oh, it's very important that you learn the language, you mix with the community, you contribute to the community, you become part of it, and life will go on very smoothly." And I can see that argument in seaside towns in particular, attractive areas like the Lake District. But on the other hand, I can also see the other argument that actually just the more vibrant and active the market becomes, it spreads through the whole range of properties from bottom right to top. And I tend to favour that argument rather than being restrictive.
Yeah. I think one thing that is very challenging for smaller communities in the north that are seen as little holiday hotspots is when people buy a second home and only visit it for a couple of weeks a year. And then that can that can damage the community because there's less people in the area for sways of the year. If you're willing to rent that out during that time, then I think that provides an additional benefit. A few more people in the local pub, things like that. So, but again, there are these restrictive covenants in place to protect that.
So either be there all year or stay out the pub. One of the two. What do you think, John?
Well, we've seen exactly what you just alluded to in Cornwall, a place I used to go to a lot. And actually, I live in the New Forest and Sandbanks, and Poole is another area where there's a lot of holiday places. And in some cases, there's whole blocks that are all holiday let, and other blocks where they're sort of second homes and there's never a light on. There's no one there. And so you kind of see that scenario. In fact, you get that in some of the central London areas, in Chelsea, where you've lost that sense of community. And you can imagine the people that live there, ultimately, they're sort of looking out on properties that are empty. So, that's the key thing, I think, where just trying to make sure there's a bit of a balance. How you police that, how you enforce that, not sure.
Well, I think you're right. It's how you police it and who's policing it.
Yeah.
That's to me is the sort of difficult part. I mean, I think we all work hard, we all earn our money, and we should have an entitlement to be able to really spend it where and how we want. That's where I sort of come unstuck with the protective argument.
Yeah, because often when policies do come into play, they alienate or create another problem down the line. If it self-polices, i.e. the people that are craving a community, I might get into trouble for saying this, but craving a community, they could move to somewhere where there is a community.
Yeah. No, it's a little bit like, John, if you take Westminster, for instance, which, I mean, the council tax in Westminster for private houses used to be lower than practically anywhere in the country. It was ridiculously low. And people say, well, how come? Well, because it was being subsidised by all the high-paying shops on Oxford Street, Regent Street, Crown Estate, and all that sort of thing. So actually, this sort of commercial encouragement actually paid dividends to people who lived there. Real problem is the people who really lived there didn't need the cheap rates because they paid super expensive prices, so you were sort of paying £300-400 quid a year on a £5-10 million house, which rubbed up the wrong way somehow. Yeah. But I mean, it is a question of balance, how you get all these things right, isn't it? And it's not an easy job. Anyway, okay, well, that's not for us, I suppose. John, I'm considering retrofitting solar panels on 2 HMO houses I own. This is becoming quite a critical consideration as my rents include energy costs within them. I know what the salespeople tell me, but do the experts think that the payback time versus the capital costs and the instancy of any reduction in energy costs will actually be worthwhile? Now, I know it's very complex, isn't it? But
yeah, I mean, the reference of instancy, that's not going to happen. I mean, you're incurring costs up front to put in, whether it's solar panels or it could be putting insulation or upgrading the boiler to a much more energy efficient boiler to try and achieve the same thing.
And it's many thousands of pounds, isn't it?
Exactly. And how far do you go with that? And then, as the question states, how quickly do you get that benefit back? I mean, if you're a long-term investor, buy to let, and you're going to keep a portfolio or build a portfolio for the long term, then that ultimately surely is the way forward, because over time you're clearly benefiting, on the savings. I mean, the other thing is existing properties don't always lend themselves to, for example, the solar panels in the question. Have you got the right roof for that? Sometimes there's only 30-40% of the roof that's actually viable for solar panels. Is the property big enough to make it worthwhile? So there's all sorts of different scenarios that become relevant to that question.
I just struggled though to see the government's policy here, because they've come out this last few months saying, "Oh, go for solar panels. They're great. This and that," and they've stopped the subsidy.
Yeah.
So I just don't get that.
No, it seems to be a common trait with government. I don't want to bring up other scenarios, but diesel cars, whatever it might be, electric cars, they kind of just they push a real initiative. People can get behind that, and then it's just the rug's pulled, and you're kind of left thinking, well, I was behind that, or I was about to do that. It's not worth me doing that now.
Yeah. Well, I know I had one of the first hybrid cars, for instance. I got that and it was great. You had no congestion charge. You could park one thing or another. And then within months, the government said, oh, actually, we're stopping all the incentives for hybrid cars, which are more expensive than ordinary cars. So I thought, well, why would I buy one? You know, do I want to pay another 20 grand for my car because I've got a conscience? I'm not sure whether that washes too well.
No, worked in Hollywood.
Yeah.
It's not real life.
And again, I then went to full electric, and that was great. I agree, it's very cheap to run, no road tax. You could park for, I think it's about 45 pence or something for the first hour in Westminster, and then another 4 hours on top for nothing. And now the mayor's announced, well, that's finishing, it's all going. So just as we start to get towards electric cars, it's all fin- and it seems to be the same. These sorry, I haven't got the right term, John. The heat exchangers, heat pumps outside the houses to
air source heat pump.
Yeah. Apparently somebody went on the government website and there was just no help whatsoever, because at the end of the day, your house has got to be suitable, your flooring's got to be suitable. There's so many peripheral costs to putting them in, on top of which the actual pump itself is totally inefficient in terms of energy use. So again, these things I understand are sort of 30 or 40,000 pounds to put in. Where's the payback?
Yeah, and it's long term. It is long term. So and it's affecting your cash flow now, which in the current climate we're in doesn't mean anyone and everyone can afford it. And the other thing which you just mentioned is that if you do one or two things, it can have a knock-on effect of really meaning you should do other stuff as well. If you insulate a loft, it means the rest of the loft is ultimately frozen and pipes can crack and the boiler can fail, and the rest of the house has everything kind of then going wrong inside it. It's not one problem solved.
Well, when they do this insulation, you can often get a case where, the roof's great now and all the heat just goes out of the windows.
Exactly.
You know, so...
Well, we've got a situation now where we're seeing the end of gas boilers, aren't we? It's been a big thing. The last few years, gas boilers are getting phased out, but with current energy prices, properties with gas are actually getting higher EPCs, so the switch to electric is reducing your EPC. Again, it's another contrived and impossible sort of situation to see through and to plan for.
Well, it's all. I mean, I keep now saying, "Well, come off gas," but I can remember years ago when they first brought out wet electric central heating. It was demonised. It was so energy inefficient. It was awful. This, that, and the other. We're going back there again now. I don't know. All right. Well, on that confused note, we'll end the show. So, big thank you to Simon Dass and John Reynolds. Thank you both very much for coming in and travelling down to see us. I'm Stephen Galpin. I look forward to seeing you next time on Property Question Time.